Hello, and welcome those listening or watching to the latest episode in the Exchange Chambers podcast series. And my name's Chris Barnes, and I'm joined by Stuart McCracken, and we both specialise and have specialised for many years now in military claims. And we're going to be chatting in a fairly informal way about military claims because it's one of those areas that, first of all, is pretty specialised, can be quite niche, and secondly, it appears to be in a bit of a growth area in the last few years. And there is a feeling among some that there's been a tendency to view these claims as a bit of an easy ride, an obvious way to seek further work, to develop one's business. And in reality, there are some real pitfalls which can be encountered in military claims because they are not necessarily the same as an ordinary civilian claim. What we're going to do is just chat through some of the ways in which these claims perhaps differ a little bit to a civilian claim and pinpoint some of the points to look for, some of the pitfalls to watch out for, and generally our thoughts as to how these claims should be approached. So, Stuart, I'm over to you, really. Any immediate thoughts about principal differences between military and civilian claims? Anything which catches your eye?
Yes, so I think two in particular spring to mind. The first is liability. Obviously, those who serve are undertaking extremely dangerous activities on our behalf, and their training has to prepare them for that. And while when it comes to civilian cases, we might have a pretty good instinct from our own experiences as to what may or may not be reasonable, and when a civilian employer hasn't taken sufficient care, service is different, and establishing whether or not the MOD has breached their duty of care to servicemen or women requires a different exercise to civilian claims. And then I think the second point is quantum, because fitness standards are obviously really high in the military, and this can mean that injuries which in civilian life would be an inconvenience can result in the loss of a career in the military context. And so that then feeds into other losses like loss of earnings, but also loss of pension and other benefits to which people are entitled while they serve.
Yeah, I mean, there's some quite interesting. People listening will probably be aware that when you enlist in the military, there is a standard fitness test that you have to undergo. And thereafter, depending on precisely what trade you're in, what regiment you're in, what role you're undertaking, there are annual fitness tests. And it always amazes me, firstly, how fit many of the people in the military are, and secondly, how unfit many of the people in the military are, because we come across people who are really grossly unsuited to continuing military service. But on occasion, they can be kept on because they have a particular trade that doesn't necessarily require that high level of physical expertise or ability. I mean, is that something you've come across, Stuart? I mean, you mentioned about how these physical restrictions can impact more on the military than on civilians. Any obvious examples of that or positive examples of that?
Yeah, and a good example, that touches on what you mentioned, Chris, about differing fitness standards at different times of military service is a case I did recently where my client had an underlying problem with his hip that he didn't know about, and that became a problem during an exercise when he had a fall. And the medical evidence was agreed. You would have had these problems anyway, but he would have had them in a few years' time. And in civilian life, firstly, that might have just been an inconvenience because he was able to do many things that we would day to day. But in military life, it made a big difference to it. But in particular, what came out of the evidence is that actually those few years down the line made all the difference to his career because he would have been more senior. The fitness requirements would have been less stringent, and he would have been able to stay in. Whereas, as it happened, he was medically discharged because of it. So it made a huge difference to him.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, actually, isn't it? I had a very similar issue a few years ago where someone was injured right on the cusp of commissioning, and he was about to receive a late entry commission and couldn't proceed with it because he was injured quite badly. And the evidence was very strongly that as an officer, he'd have been kept on. As even a pretty senior NCO, he's no longer up to the grade. And I think it's really interesting how you have these different standards that apply throughout a career. I mean, the entry enlisting requirements are really quite onerous in some ways. And yet you get people through their service or quite a long way down through their service who are really nowhere near meeting those entry requirements. There was a really interesting statistic a few years ago, which people might be aware of, from Afghanistan, where after Op Herrick, I think it was 12, something like that, the Royal Anglian Regiment came home and all had their hearing tested. And over 2/3 of those who served on that tour no longer met the criteria for enlisting into the army from a hearing perspective. So, yeah, really interesting. Okay, I mean, you mentioned, Stuart, about the losses that can be the losses that can be claimed, the loss of a military career, and so on and so forth. Does the valuation of those losses vary, do you think, or is it approached differently from a civilian career? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's approached really differently. So loss of earnings, we'll be familiar with from civilian claims as well, won't we? Because if someone can't do their job anymore, whether they're in service or not, we work out the difference between what they're earning now and what they would have earned. But trying to work out what someone would have earned in a military career is much more complicated than in civilian life, as you know, and that's because partly we need to know how they would have progressed, because we've got the promotion structure. We also got the different trades that they might have gone into, different specialisms, all of which can attract different benefits, different payments, and also different likelihoods of serving. But the most important thing is how long they would have served for, because if they serve a full career, which is 20 years, they're entitled to an immediate pension. Now, in civilian claims, pension losses are sometimes a bit of an afterthought, aren't they? But when it comes to the military, the pension claim can be the biggest at a loss, and indeed often is, in my experience, because when you get to 20 years, which might be in a military career when you're 40, you get an immediate pension.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it can be very easy when you're approaching one of these claims to get too tied up in the whole issue of promotion and how far you'd have gone, whether it had been W01, W02, staff sergeant, whatever. Whereas actually, as you say, what really makes a difference is duration of service. That's where the real money lies. And your client will be naturally keen to emphasise their promotion prospects. But that really plays out less importantly when it comes down to pound, shilling and pence than the duration of service, doesn't it?
Yeah, and that you obviously you get statistics which help to guide you as to what length of service is. And your client will often say they would have served a full career. Now, statistically, someone enlisting is unlikely to serve a full career, but it makes perfect sense that that's what your client says, because they're still serving at the time they're injured. Yeah. They're enjoying it. That's why they're still there.
What are these statistics? What are these statistics that we have or that can be seen in these cases?
Well, there are different statistics depending on which branch of the armed forces you enlist in and what your trade is, and different staging points in your career as well. So there are statistical analysis as to, for example, how long a Royal Marine who's been serving for, say, 10 years is likely to continue to serve, whether they're likely statistically to get to the full career mark of 20 years and beyond.
Yeah. I mean, these statistics can, I sometimes think, be elevated to a sort of gold standard of evidence, whereas actually I'm not aware, but many of you are, Stuart, I'm not aware of any case in which the statistics have been determinative. They're a starting point, and then you move from them depending on your own particular circumstances. Can you?
Yeah.
I mean, there's also quite interesting background to the statistics. So, for example, if you're a Commonwealth soldier, in inverted commas, that being the cohort of soldiers to move, for example, that cold injury claims normally come. But if you're a Commonwealth-based soldier, then generally you serve a longer term than if you're an Anglo soldier. Ditto, I think the Gurkhas, they have a very high or lengthy retention rate. So you do need to start with the statistics and then massage them or move from them.
Yeah, and it can depend a lot on your individual, can't it? Because if someone's just starting out, the statistics may carry more weight because it's hard to know, how they were enjoying it, where they were aiming for. But equally, if someone's served a long time and had clear plans in place to continue to serve a full career, then you might depart from the statistics in an upward direction and say, well, my client, was clearly going to make it to a full career. Really, the chance of leaving is negligible, whatever the statistics say.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one of the interesting points is this whole issue of benefits, because some benefits everyone will be aware of. If you can dabble in these claims, you'll be aware of things like subsidised housing. You'll be aware of things like free sporting facilities, dental and medical care, all that sort of stuff. But there's some quite esoteric things which actually can be hugely valuable. So parachute pay, if you've got the wings, so to speak, parachute pay can be very, very generous. Divers paid, if you're a qualified military diver. And that doesn't just mean the army, it can be in any of the trades or any of the forces. Diving pay adds quite a lot. Submarine pay.
Yeah.
There's some quite interesting legal issues about whether you can recover some of these benefits if they are compensatory for a particular hardship and you no longer undergoing the hardship. But you really need to look out for this stuff, because the benefits claim can add thousands a year to a loss of earnings. And if you approach this just as a conventional civilian claim, loss of earnings, loss of pension, and then leave it at that, your head's going to be from the chop, really.
You are, and that's why expert evidence is so important, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, do you generally in PI claims nowadays we don't use employment evidence, do we? Particularly even in CP cases for youthful claimants, you don't generally have employment evidence. Why different in military claims?
Yeah, well, you don't. And on the other hand, in military claims, would you ever have a case without it? I can't think of one, because you need it for many reasons. You need it to plot, as I say, the career path. And promotion may not be the most important thing, but you still need to try to plot their path through the ranks up until discharge. You need help with the chance of discharge and serving a full career, and in particular, you need help with the cost and the value of the various benefits as well, to allow you to do the calculations for loss of earnings, and particularly for the pension loss, because you need to know what lump sum they're getting, when, what the final salary is, how that translates into an immediate pension, how that translates to a pension at state pension age.
And it's become, this is only my personal experience, it's become much more complex, the pension losses in the recent years, hasn't it? Because of the McCloud judgment and so on and so forth. There are, it's not just the case of plugging the numbers into the calculator like it used to be.
No, it is
more complicated now.
Yeah.
Okay. Only other point on employment evidence, I suppose, that occurs to me is that you need to go to the right people, don't you?
Absolutely.
There's various outfits who specialise in military claims. You cannot go to a general or a generalist employment expert because they'll get it wrong. So really important, really important. Well, what about this? I mean, moving on, Stuart, I agree with you that this whole presentation of losses is fundamentally different in a military claim to a normal civilian claim, but switching it to a rather different area, it occurs to me, and this is something which I've seen it quite a few times, particularly in the larger claims, that rehabilitation takes a really different role in military claims for two reasons, and in a way they're mutually inconsistent. The first is that the in-house rehab facilities at the MOD are fantastic. So Headley Court, as was, and now Stanford Hall, have what I think is regarded as world-class rehabilitation programs. And they have fabulous expertise, they're multidisciplinary, they'll give you every potential input that you need. And if you are really seriously injured while you're serving, and you are referred to Headley Court, as was Stanford Hall now, then you're likely to get world-class rehab. And it can be residential, inpatient, for many months at a time. The sort of package that we can never dream of getting as a civilian. And my experience of it, and I've been a couple of times to Headley Court, I've never been to Stanford Hall, but my experience of it is that the atmosphere is so conducive to recovery, because there's always someone worse than you in the next door bed. You might have lost 2 legs, they've lost 4 legs, 2 legs, 2 arms, and their genitals, for example. Back if we look back to the Afghanistan period and the IED period. So there's always people worse off. Everyone's always cheery. You're working together, hugely positive. Notable as well, I should say, for the quality of the cars outside, because we'll come to talk about the AFCS, but if you're badly injured like this, you get a big payout, and lots of people use it, and use it quick, and buy a fantastic car. But a really, really good world-class rehabilitation facility. But that takes me to my second point, which is that once you're discharged, you really are left on your own. And I think this is a real problem for many seriously injured military claimants, because they are used to being coddled. They've lived in a very positive environment throughout their military service. They're badly injured. They then have phenomenal rehabilitation and support, and then they're medically discharged, and everything changes. They're suddenly reliant upon the NHS, which isn't great for rehab. And interestingly, at this stage, my experience, I don't know about yours, Stuart, but my experience is that the MOD doesn't support paid rehab. If you write to the Treasury Solicitor, GLD, or one of their panel firms, and ask for a chunky interim payment to pay for the sort of conventional rehab program that we see in other cases, they're really quite resistant to that. And it's bizarre that they can be so supportive while you serve and then wash their hands of you once you don't. But any experience of that, Stuart?
Yeah,
I mean, you've encountered?
Well, it is, and I think what you often encounter is when someone has been discharged, which is often when they'll come to us and we'll see them. and particularly if that's been a period of time after discharge, there's often a feeling that they've been left behind, that the military's forgotten about them.
Yeah.
And I think that's partly because, as you say, there isn't that engagement after discharge, but also because there's been such good engagement while they were serving. It was effectively their full-time job was rehabilitation, and that's just never really the case in civilian life, is it? It's never your job to rehabilitate, and so I think that sort of that difference can be pretty hard for people to come to terms with.
I mean, I think one of the interesting features that you see in a lot of these cases is just how damaging the loss of a career is. We all talk about loss of continuing employment as a bit of a sort of shortcut, but actually people hugely regret losing their military career, and they can find it really damaging, can't they, when they don't feel supported. Stuart and I fought a claim. We're just waiting judgment at the moment recently. But one of the features that came out in that case was the anger of the client at the lack of support, or the perceived lack of support from the regiment after his accident, because they live so closely together. You live and breathe with all your colleagues, and they're supported both from the chain of command, but also from each other. And you cut that off, and it's really difficult. And I think that's why you often see quite serious physical injuries accompanied by really quite a pronounced medical reaction, don't you? An adjustment reaction to the loss of career.
Yeah, and these are sort of one type of claims where loss of continuing employment really it bites,
doesn't it?
And the awards are relatively trivial, but I've had a client recently who, when you're serving with people, you look after each other, you care about each other, and you almost do anything for each other, because if you don't, it might be the difference between life and death. And he just, the way he articulated it to me, he just doesn't have that in civilian life. He hasn't found it. His colleagues in civilian work, he knows, wouldn't do that for him and don't care for him in that way. And he's sort of that bond, that kinship has been lost.
Yeah, I mean, it just reminds me, actually, there's nothing that we can do about this, really, because, as lawyers, it's something we've got to recognise, it's something we've got to reflect on, and we've got to support our clients, I suppose. But there are some organisations that you can refer to in the more serious cases. Help for Heroes, although it's not quite as high profile as it was a few years ago, they still have huge resources that can be used to support people once they've been discharged. SAFA, Lesnar, which are for amputees, the Legion, British Legion, even the Veterans Agency. Their role, I think, has been quite interesting, because it can be very easy to criticise the Veterans Agency, partly because they administer the Armed Forces Compensation Scheme we'll touch on, but also because they need a bit of a whipping boy, really, for military claimants and their instructing solicitors, and for politicians, usually. And there is definitely a role for the Veterans Agency in the continuing care of the seriously injured. And I have seen cases where the SVPA have paid for a case manager to do what they can to muster statutory support, things like that, post-discharge. So don't discount any of these organisations, really. They are all military-based organisations, and as such, they bring value, even if it's only maintaining that link to the military and trying to anaesthetise your client from the effects of the discharge. I mean, AFCS, we talk about that, Stuart. Unlikely that anyone listening isn't aware of what that consists of or what it does, but very, very briefly, what is the AFCS, and should we know about it? Should we care about it?
Yeah, we should. I mean, the Armed Forces Compensation Scheme is a statutory scheme set up to cover all serving and former members of the regular and reserve armed forces, and it's a non-fault scheme. And that's particularly important because there may be circumstances where, for whatever reason, you can't establish a breach of duty on the part of the MOD. It may be a combat immunity situation, for example. But the Armed Forces Compensation Scheme is there to provide compensation to those members of the armed forces who are injured during service. Time limits are more generous than civil claims. Generally, compensation is less generous.
What are the time limits?
Well, it's 7 years in most circumstances, but there are some exceptions in others, for example, incapacity. And unlike civil claims generally, these awards can be reviewed. So if things get worse within a certain period of time, you can come back and say, things have got worse, can I revisit my award, please? And if you meet the next tariff up, then you can. Yeah. But they're really important because you get a lump sum, but depending on your level of injury and where in the quite strict tariff you fall, you can also qualify for a guaranteed income payment, and that can be hugely valuable. A guaranteed income payment is a tax-free sum paid monthly, but calculated by the year, paid for life.
Yeah.
And for example, if you're getting £15,000 guaranteed income payment per year at the age of 30 or 35 or so, when you work that out over the course of someone's life, it's almost £1 million.
Yeah.
So it's well worth having.
And it's not just for that period during which they would have been in service, is it? It continues even up to retirement age, state retirement age, and even beyond.
Absolutely.
It's genuine for life. And the other point I think to note is that it's index linked. So it goes up every year. I think it's CPI, I can't remember, or RPI. But it's linked to inflation. It will go up every year for life and remain tax-free.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's absolutely fantastic. But it's really important to be aware of this stuff when you're doing the civil claims, isn't it? Because you need to work out how it all interacts and overlaps.
Yeah, you do. I mean, the broad rule of thumb, again, you should all be aware of this. If there is a substantial AFCS payment being made or having been made, then you need to know about it. And you need to give specific consideration to how it interacts with the civil claim and the damages, because it's not entirely straightforward. Okay, if you're badly injured in the military, you can have all sorts of income streams thereafter. You can have military benefits which continue. So, for example, the military equivalent of the personal independence payment. You can have free prosthetics under the veterans panel, the prosthetics panel. You can have GIPs, the guaranteed income payments Stuart referred to, and all of these things potentially interact with the civilian claims for damages. And you need to think about how you protect your client. Because ultimately, if you're going to be giving credit for any of those things, by which I mean knocking you off your damages, you need to make sure that you have some facility for reopening the claim in the event that the so-called guaranteed income payments vary. Because they're not actually guaranteed at all, are they? They're at the whim of the government. And if funding dries up, or the government changes its mind and changes the regulations, there can be no guarantee that they'll continue.
That's right, and some are specifically made on an interim basis as well. So they're going to be revisited, say, 2 years after they're made, and there's no guarantee it will be maintained at the same level. So yeah, you've got to make sure you're protecting your client when you settle any civil claim.
I mean, we do sometimes get involved in the AFCS cases themselves, and the process, as people may be aware, generally is you put in a form, you apply, and then it's considered by the Veterans Agency, and you have a right to a review and then an appeal. And I think you're involved in some of the appeals, aren't you, Stuart? You're doing that.
Yeah, that's right.
On a fairly regular basis. Any particular sort of buzz issues at the moment with AFCS appeals? Any areas where you think the veterans people are taking an inappropriate response?
Well, one of the particular difficulties is psychiatric injury, and one of the reasons for that is because of the wording of the tariff and the scheme, and the wording of the tariff and the scheme is very specific, and it's really important to, so far as you're able to, address that specific wording when you're addressing the tribunal and making your application. But particular difficulties arise, for example, that definition of permanence. You might think we all know what that means.
Doesn't permanent mean forever, or is it
well,
not that straightforward?
I'm afraid, Chris, as you know, it's not that straightforward. It means something actually quite different. It effectively means you've had treatment of adequate duration and amount, and that there's really no significant prospect of improvement. So even if you're going to improve a little bit but still be very seriously injured, then it could be said that you don't meet that definition. So it's important to deal with that, and also to deal with sort of how affected you are, because the level of the tariff, which affects the level of both the lump sum payment and the guaranteed income payment, is important. And definitions like severe restriction, moderate restriction are important. So that the Court of Appeal, it's quite unusual, I think, for cases like this to get to the Court of Appeal, but Court of Appeal earlier this year, in the case of Pearson, dealt with the distinction between a severe functional limitation or restriction and a moderate one. And one of the differences in the scheme is the use of the word regular. So regular work was used under moderate. And on that basis, it was found that Mr. Pearson, who was working as a medical member of the first tier tribunal, was, because he was working 1 day a week, it said he was still in regular work, so it can only be a moderate restriction. And the Court of Appeal held, well, that's not the be all and end all, because actually his capacity for work had been gradually reducing over time because of the psychological injury that he had. And the Court of Appeal emphasised the need for consistent work, not just regular work. So if someone's, working regularly 1 day a week, but they had been working more, and before that they'd been working even more, it could easily be said they would fall within the more severe definition. Yeah,
I mean, just as an aside, if the Veterans Agency turned down even a medical member of their own panel or their own tribunal, doesn't fill you with confidence, does it? But these things really matter, not only because there is a difference in lump sum award between the different brackets, but the percentage dip you get, so the percentage of your previous earnings that you're paid by way of a regular annual payment or monthly payment, that percentage varies, doesn't it, depending upon the lump sum award that you've received.
Absolutely.
So even pushing the award up by one bracket can have huge consequences over a lifetime.
It'll be hundreds of thousands of pounds.
Yeah, really important. There are some firms who will handle AFCS appeals, and we are instructed from time to time in AFCS appeals. I did one last year, and they're really important work. But you do need to consider them alongside civil claims, really, don't you? And particularly those, as Stuart says, where you might lose because, gosh, they're valuable. Really quite high value. The only point I would make, and it arose in a case that I fought about 8 years ago now, 7-8 years ago, and we sought to argue in that case that because the veterans people had still been able to consider the AFCS claim and determine it some 5 or so years after the accident, we sought to argue based on that there was no prejudice and therefore the Section 33 discretion should be exercised. We had an issue down at the time because of the lateness that the claimant came to us. And the court, probably rightly I'm afraid, dismissed that argument on the basis that there's a fundamental difference between a no-fault scheme and one where fault has to be established. So they are very different, but you do need to know about both. I mean, what about, you touched briefly at the start, Stuart, about the different sort of liability themes, and I think we all benefit from looking at cases which have more interesting facts by way of background than your normal RTA and so on and so forth. But are there any sort of specific forms of injury or specific types of claim that you only ever see in the military or you rarely see elsewhere?
Yeah, so the one that jumps out is non-freezing cold injury. From what I've heard, is an injury that if you went to your civilian GP and asked them about it, they wouldn't know most of them what you were talking about because it's really unknown in civilian life. It's an injury that seems only to affect servicemen and women. It's caused, as you might expect, by exposure to the cold, often in conjunction with exposure to wet conditions as well. And it can cause damage to the vascular system or the nerves or a combination of the two. And even though often a good recovery can be made when soldiers rewarm, if they have suffered a non-freezing cold injury, they'll be permanently cold sensitized. And that's important because, firstly, it can mean a lot of the military activities that they'd be required to do, they're no longer able to, so they might be medically discharged. Even if they're not, the sort of civilian work that they're able to do may be restricted as well, depending on what their ambitions were for the future.
I think that the tragedy of these is that the sort of people who suffer NFCIs, I mean, there's also a genetic predisposition, isn't there? Black African soldiers are much more likely to suffer these injuries, but the sort of people who suffer these injuries are the ones, the infantry generally, aren't they? They're the ones spending time in a basher, trawling through water, etc., in the middle of winter. They're the ones who these injuries affect particularly badly, because if you're in the infantry and you can't go back to precisely those activities, there's nothing for you, is there? If you're in the signals or something, then this might not be so damaging. Catastrophic for a military career in the infantry.
That's right. And some people, they might not be medically discharged, but they might be downgraded. Well, you can stay in, but you can work in the stores. And for most people, that's not why they signed up, is it?
Yeah, I mean, there's quite an interesting point there, because how often do we see clients whose career follows exactly that path? They're injured, and then they're placed into the stores, and it's just actually, it's boring, it's tedious, it's part of a military role. There's no communality like there is when you're serving with other people in the field. And they then put in their papers, they're voluntarily discharged. And they then try to seek a loss of earnings, and the MOD seeks to argue, well, it was your decision to resign. You could still be serving now, getting all these benefits, enjoying the pension in due course. And I've always thought it's a really unattractive argument, actually. I mean, I never fought it to trial, because I think generally the MOD concede the point, because ultimately, how can it be so unreasonable as to break the chain of causation, to resign from doing something that you never signed up for, really?
Absolutely. Of all the jobs in all the world, this is the sort of job where you don't want to be stuck in the stores. If you signed up for this, you haven't signed up to do administrative work. Have you got any other examples, Chris, of sort of injuries or claims that might just be really seen in a military context?
Yeah, there's some. I mean, some of the bullying claims, that's not just a military thing, because we see bullying in civilian claims, bullying and harassment, the nurses' claims that went to the Supreme Court a few years ago, etc., etc. there's a real tranche of bullying claims coming through at the moment. But if you want to look a bit more niche, there is an ongoing, they're not quite as frequent as they used to be, but there are ongoing pelvic stress fracture cases.
Right.
Because one of the problems the military gets is that it attracts recruits often from a fairly impoverished background. And they can be badly nourished, they can be unfit, and they're often very young as well. And there is no doubt, because there's lots of studies on this, that if you're 16 years old and you've had a bad diet for the last 5 years, and maybe you're underweight or something like that, and then you're sent off to Catterick to undergo, training with everyone else, you are at a very high risk of stress fractures, whether it's shin splints, that's stress fractures essentially, or similar in your calf, your lower leg, or particularly for women, these pelvic stress fractures. And these can be really bad news, they can be debilitating. On some occasions, they can really wreck you. They certainly stop your military career. But the other feature, I suppose, of pelvic stress fractures is that there's a higher incidence where women and men are required to exercise together, because the nature of military service is that where you are exercising, a lot of the time you're marching in step or you're running in step and so on and so forth. If the soldier calling out the steps is a man, then their cadence and their stride length is likely to be different to a woman. Sounds obvious, but actually this is really important. 5'10" PTI, male PTI, will have a different natural cadence and stride length to a 5-foot woman. So their cadence will be slower, that is, they take longer steps, but their stride length will be greater. And as a result, if the woman wants to keep up and she wants to march in step, she's going to be striding out in a rather uncomfortable and unnatural way. So you do get these really quite severe pelvic stress fracture cases. And if one of these clients approaches you, you need to look at them really quite carefully. These are not easy claims, but it's very easy to think, this is just someone who, this is just one of the normal sorts of things that we see with train hard, fight easy, the whole MOD methodology. But actually, there is real fault there. And there's some very good experts who've done a lot of studies on this. So just something to look out for and get specialist advice when you need to. And the other interesting area, I think, is the counterpoint to the cold injury case that you talked about, which is the heat exhaustion. Any heat exhaustion cases that you've seen?
Not many. I think it's often the particularly severe sorts of training, like SAS training and the like, where I have touched on it. But have you done that?
Yeah, no, I had one from the Buckingham Beacons design a few years ago, and I've seen others from standard military training. There's a very onerous joint service publication. These are the military's written policies which set out what have to be done when exercising on a hot day. And needless to say, a lot of the time it's ignored. But heat exhaustion is bad. It's bad news. You can die from it. We all know that 4 people died in Brecon Beacons. Can't remember precisely now. But you can die from it, or it can cause real long-term, lifelong issues. And so, yes, you get heat exhaustion claims for civilians, if you work on a building site in the sun, etc., etc. But it's particularly bad for the servicemen because they have this culture of continuing pushing themselves, etc., etc. So some really interesting aspects to all of these. What I suppose we want to get across, really, if we can, is that these are very rewarding claims, and actually my life is that the claimants are great to deal with.
Absolutely. I love dealing with these cases.
Yeah. Interesting, factually, respectful, generally truthful, actually, and good witnesses, and, they've really lost something of value. They might have moved to a civilian career and they might be earning more than they used to, but they couldn't care less. They'd much rather still be back serving with their mates. So they've really lost something of value, and we find out a lot of that. So that's just our general ramblings, if you like, for 30 minutes, half an hour or so. These are really interesting cases. If anyone's got any queries, drop us an email, give us a ring, and don't just tag on this work. Okay? You do need to do this properly, because if you don't, this is a community which speaks to each other. This is a community which shares ideas, shares feedback. And if you don't do a good job, one way or another, it's likely to be found out, and there could be consequences. But thanks ever so much, everyone, for listening or for watching. We'll call it a day there. Keep your eyes peeled, if you can, please, for further podcasts. These are part of a regular series that we do in Exchange Chambers. And hopefully going forwards, many of them will be videoed, if that adds anything for you. And until the next time, thanks very much.